So I've spent 25 years studying efforts in the US to make schools more equitable, and particularly focused on schools that were diverse in terms of the race, the language background, and the socioeconomic status of the students attending the school. And what I've learned about those reforms is that they nearly always fail. So this afternoon, I want to take you into the topic of systems reform and talk about what I've learned about efforts that systems make in order to make their schools more equitable, and what I have come to believe through studying lots of places about what elements of reform it takes if you're going to go after those kinds of reforms. So changing systems so that equity and inclusion are the norm, not the exception, not the wonderful little one school in the system, but so they are the norm, requires something far more than the traditional strategic planning and system improvement methods. It also, those are important, but it also requires something that's far more like a social movement. And that means that system leaders, policymakers, teachers have to either become social movement activists themselves or to ally themselves with social movement activists in order to make those kinds of changes. And I will explain what I mean by that and why I think this is important and what I've learned in my research. But I want you to know, I think the stakes are very, very high. Each one of the systems in the in the world, is becoming more diverse, and especially those in the Northern Hemisphere with the global migration. Diverse democracies will only survive if those who are different from resident, long-standing populations can see themselves in the hopes and dreams of the country, of the nation. They will only feel affiliated to a nation state if they are structurally included in the system. I hate to be overly dramatic, but I think that the terrorism and the alienation that we see around the globe today is in part a result of feelings of alienation and structural exclusion. Now, schools are not entirely responsible for this, but schools are key. So let me explain a little bit more. So what goes wrong with equity reforms? Well, part of it is that equity reforms are countercultural in diverse capitalist democracies. Inequality is endemic to capitalist democracies and endemic in the role that schools play in the development and maintenance of those democracies. Schools have two jobs they have to balance. One, they have to teach the democratic values, the beliefs, the respect for others, the goals of democracy, and to stress the value, the core value of equality. That is the foundation, the bedrock of democracy. But schools also have to prepare students to live in a capitalist economy where it's a very, not so much flat and equitable, equal, but much more like a pyramid, where most are at the bottom and a few are at the top. And not only do they have to prepare students to take their place in that pyramid, they have to teach students that the inequalities inherent in that pyramid are justifiable and they're reasonable. So we end up, and we see this in the US in dramatic ways, partly because of the changes in our culture, but that norms of individualism, of scarcity, that there really isn't enough good stuff to make sure everybody has it, competition and merit, that all of these norms that are so powerful make inequality sensible. They make it seem normal that even if schools say they have equal opportunities, that disparities are really expected, that they're endemic to the system. It seems normal for young people from advantaged groups to succeed at much higher rates than young people from disadvantaged groups. Now, there are politics involved here because, in a way, we do create a zero-sum game. There is not room for everyone at the top of this pyramid. And advantaged parents know this. And they understand that in order to transmit their privilege, their place in society to their children, they have to do everything they can to make sure that their children's education is better than other children. Sociologist Sam Lucas at UC Berkeley calls this effectively maintained inequality. That inequality is maintained through families acting in their own self-interest and their knowledge of the inequitable system that we live in. Now, no strategic plan, no matter how good it is by itself, can overcome those kinds of beliefs and the politics that keep inequities in place. And if you're in a system that's racially and linguistically diverse, you will see the patterns of inequality fall along those very lines, and that race and language and cultural differences are also used to justify inequalities, to rationalize inequalities. So all this means that making school systems equitable is not an engineering problem that simply requires the cleverest, best designed kinds of solutions. Of course, we need clever, well-designed technical solutions, and there are all kinds of solutions that can make schooling equitable for all kids. In fact, it's not rocket science to come up with the techniques to make schooling equitable. The hard part is that make that acceptable as the norm for all systems. So what's required is really a social movement that changes hearts and minds and that builds and redistributes political power. And that's what social movements do. So there are 4 elements that I believe are essential in this social movement work that educators and system leaders can become very involved with. One is you need powerful ideas compellingly communicated. So you need a vision of what's possible in terms of saying we must act on our loftiest goals, and here are the ideas that can move us forward as a society. But you also need powerful examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Now, fortunately, in every system, you can find examples. And people want to say, oh, well, that's just kind of a boutique thing. You couldn't do that everywhere. But in fact, those examples should be lifted up. And people asked, if we can do this once, by what means could we ever argue that we couldn't do this for everyone, that this is possible? So we have powerful ideas, powerful examples, and then we need powerful policy engineering. I mean, policy engineering does not go away. We need smart analysts to ensure that the systems can change in the ways that get rid of all the barriers to equitable systems and put in the incentives and supports and resources to help foster them. But finally, we need powerful people. People who use both knowledge and power to advocate for political change, who organize to rebalance the current asymmetries in power, in privilege, and influence on the system. So I want to talk about that last one a little bit more because I think that's probably the least familiar. Citizens must make demands on policymakers and educators and the courts in order to insist on equity. In fact, many policymakers, educators, and judges are very glad and welcome this kind of political pressure because it gives them the space to do the things they would like to do but can't do because power so resides with the most privileged. So in the US, You've heard about the teacher bashing, the public school bashing that's gone on. If you were in the California group, you heard a lot of specific details about that. But activists are using political power to stop top-down school closing, teacher firings, and the proliferation of standardized testing. And they've had quite remarkable success. They're calling for local improvement strategies, college preparatory curriculum for all kids, community schools supported by resources and capacity building. And I think the example that we heard of California with its new local control funding formula and local control accountability plan, that is the result of not only some smart policy engineering by those at the top, but also a result of the activism that happened through court cases and grassroots engagement and organizing, demanding that the system change so it becomes more equitable. It's not perfect, but in fact, absent that political power, activism, these are actually some real Californians who were engaged in these movements to try to put pressure on the system. Without them, it wouldn't have happened. Now, why is grassroots important? Well, obviously it's important because it helps change the power dynamic and it builds social capital in ways that can influence the decision making because you have different voices at the table. But it also creates powerful narratives that defies the stereotypes that many people have about people like these people, about what they care about, how capable they are, what they can do, and what their place is in the system. It's very hard to maintain a stereotype and a deficit version of someone when they're in your face with knowledge and power demanding system change. And finally, in the end, those are the ones who will sustain any reforms. That equity reforms may get put in place, but they will only last if there's the activism. So, to repeat, systems are only likely to become equitable when we can shift this balance, when we engage in systems change process that looks very much like the messy, uneven, sometimes conflictual democratic processes that we want in schools and society. And the stakes are very high. So I ask you to think hard as we talk about system change, to think about social movements as well as about strategic plans. Thank you.